This video compiles exactly 1 hour of content discussing Gol D Roger, providing a thorough breakdown of his power and legend in the One Piece story. Some of this analysis may be very surprising to many of you. While much of the video will discuss Roger's legendary status, it will also compare other characters in the series to him, and how they could be closer to Roger's level than fans might realize. If you're already familiar with my channel, the last part of this video will feature entirely new content. Let's kick things off with a simple question. Was Roger actually the strongest character in One Piece? In the eyes of the people living in the One Piece world, Gold Roger is the strongest person who's ever existed. This, however, is more than likely not true. This video will go over how there have been multiple characters in this story more powerful than Roger. We'll start by breaking down Roger's reputation in the One Piece world, and why he for years has been seen as the pinnacle of strength. After this, we'll address why this is actually probably not true, and why characters like Joy Boy and Imu have likely achieved power far greater than Roger, and that they might not be the only ones. A good place to start is by making one thing very clear. Roger actually was someone who was incredibly powerful. Roger might even have the single best known resume of any fighter in this series. To go down the list, the notable figures Roger has fought include Whitebeard, Monkey D. Garp, Rocksteady Sebek, Shiki, Kaido, Sengoku, and Kosuke Oden. This is essentially the who's who of some of the strongest figures in this story. Even though we haven't actually seen many of these fights, the few times we've witnessed Roger in action, he's lived up to his legendary reputation. He has been able to perform incredible feats like blow Oden away with one attack, shake an entire island with his Conqueror's Haki, as well as go through a 3-day-long battle with the Whitebeard pirates. As impressive as all of this is, however, Roger's reputation completely supersedes these accomplishments, and it's clear that he has achieved an immortal legacy in the current One Piece era. This is seen when the Straw Hats encounter other legendary figures of the world such as Garp and Whitebeard during the story. Even though they're some of the strongest men in the world, these characters are considered to be legends simply because they were able to fight on par with Roger. This is actually a frequent thing that happens in the story, where people talk about Roger's strength being out of this world. While Roger is known mainly for his treasure and his title of Pirate King, he is also pretty universally known as the strongest fighter of all time. When people in the One Piece world talk about someone being absurdly powerful, they use Roger as their example. This also applies to many of the characters from Roger's era, who are surprisingly honest about Roger's power. When someone like Shiki claims that he could personally kill Roger, Sengoku quickly rebuttals him, saying that Roger would have beaten Shiki. Shiki himself might have also been exaggerating in this moment, as he after Roger's death inadvertently admits that he was inferior to him. When Shiki talks about the new pirate era with Whitebeard, he says that Roger was a wall that was holding both him and Whitebeard back, heavily implying that he considered Roger to be superior to both of them. Another notable character who believes that Roger when he was alive was the strongest is Kaido. Kaido believes that Roger proved how powerful Haki is by conquering the seas without the devil fruit. While there could be many ways of interpreting this line, for me, Kaido's message is clear. Roger became the absolute strongest with just Haki. This is a very noteworthy quote, as Kaido has personally fought most of the strongest characters of his time, and believed that he himself was the strongest being alive during the Wano arc. Yet, out of all the characters, he evoked the name of Roger to use as an example of ultimate power. There is also another pirate who actually lived through Roger's era that had even greater things to say about Roger. While not as infamous as Kaido, Don Jinchao was still a notable figure in the past. For example, Garp respected his strength enough to practice by destroying entire mountains before facing him. According to Jinchao, if someone in the current era wanted to surpass Roger's legacy, they would have to beat all of the 4 emperors as well as the 3 admirals. While a very grandiose claim, it is arguably accurate, as Roger in his life left behind a trail of destruction of some of the strongest fighters who'd ever lived, including figures who'd at one point or another become emperors and admirals. What's also noteworthy here is that people recognizing Roger as the strongest is not something that they do out of adoration. Roger is a figure who's actually hated by most people in the One Piece world, and many of the characters just mentioned were actually his rivals. Someone like Sengoku goes as far as calling Roger the greatest fiend the world has ever seen. Meanwhile, Kaido considered Roger to be a soft man, despite all of his power. There are also the regular civilians of the One Piece world, who hate Roger, and blame him for infesting the world with pirates because he started the Great Pirate Age. Yet, despite this bias, the world still by and large recognizes Roger as the strongest in history. However, none of this actually proves that Gol D Roger actually was the strongest character ever in this story. This is because of one simple thing. All the characters that were just mentioned, as well as the One Piece world at large, do not know the ancient characters who were and are stronger than Roger. This is because of the world government, who've done a very thorough job of wiping all records of the existence of these characters. Namely, the two characters in One Piece who more than likely are stronger than Roger are Joy Boy and Emu. Or, perhaps a better way to describe these two is as the leaders of the two factions that tore the world apart in the Great War that took place during the Void Century. While the people of the current One Piece era do not know this, the world of One Piece was 900 to 800 years ago ravaged by a great war between the Ancient Kingdom and the allied forces of the 20 kingdoms that would later create the world government. There are several things in the story that indicate that Joy Boy and Emu were figures far more powerful than Roger. Joy Boy is someone who only a handful of characters in the current One Piece era know about, but those that do know him speak of Joy Boy as if he was someone far above Gol D Roger. Notably, Roger himself talks of Joy Boy in this way. When Roger finally reached the final island and discovered Joy Boy's treasure, he says that he wished he'd lived in the same era as him. More importantly, however, after discovering that there's going to be a second coming of Joy Boy in the future, Roger believes that this figure will surpass him. This sentiment is later echoed by both Oden and Kaido, who believe that the next Joy Boy and his generation will surpass the last generation of the Emperors of the Sea. This build-up of Joy Boy's power is rather warranted. According to Vegapunk, the reason why Emu had to unite 20 entire kingdoms against Joy Boy was because that's just how powerful Joy Boy's faction was. The fact that the war lasted for 100 years also means that Joy Boy should be one of the most battle-hardened and experienced characters in the whole story. If the allied forces are anything like the world government of today, this could mean that Joy Boy was for decades fighting characters who might have been on the level of the Five Elders or Navy Admirals, if not even stronger. It is also quite possible that Joy Boy was the linchpin of the Ancient Kingdom's entire military. From what little history Vegapunk has read of the Great War, he brings up Joy Boy as the central figure and main character of this conflict. According to Vegapunk, the event that also ended this war was the defeat of Joy Boy, perhaps indicating that the war couldn't have been won if he wasn't dealt with. While still a very mysterious character, we actually do also have some evidence of Joy Boy's personal combat ability. We know that he was the user of the Nika Devil Fruit, which he'd managed to awaken. The Five Elders refer to the ancient Nika Fruit as the most ridiculous power in the world, and as we've seen with Luffy, the mere awakening of the fruit put him on a whole other level in his fight against Kaido. The fact that Joy Boy had this fruit for potentially over a century, and that he frequently had to use it in combat during the Great War, paints a picture of an incredibly strong warrior, considering everything Luffy has managed to do after having only just awakened the fruit. We also know that there was even more to Joy Boy than just his devil fruit. Namely, we've now seen that his haki was also extremely powerful. Before his death, Joy Boy left a residual note of his Conqueror's haki with Emmet the robot, one of his followers. Centuries later, Emmet finally released this note during the Egghead arc, and the effects were some of the strongest Conqueror's haki seen in the entire story. The haki was actually strong enough to immediately dispel the transformations of the Five Elders. This is something that even some of the most powerful Conqueror's haki users we've seen are not capable of. For example, when Luffy first awakened the Nika Fruit, he released Conqueror's haki so strong that it frightened Kaido, and made him think that someone other than Luffy must be doing it. However, Kaido still remained in his transformed state, despite being in close proximity to Luffy. Joy Boy's Conqueror's haki blast on Egghead also managed to knock out all of the Vice Admirals in its vicinity. This is something that is once again rather unprecedented, as even some of the strongest characters in the story have difficulty knocking out anyone but very low-level characters with their Conqueror's haki. When Rayleigh used his Conquerors in the Sabodi auction house, characters like the pre-timeskip Heart Pirate still managed to stay conscious. When Big Mom activated her Conquerors during her tea party, While some of the guests were knocked out, even non-combatants like Pudding and Lufeld managed to stay conscious. Compared to this, Joy Boy's Conqueror's Haki was strong enough to knock out someone like Dole, who is not only a Haki user able to destroy Mark III Pacifista, but is also the commander of one of the Navy's New World bases. Dorian Brockie noted just how powerful Joy Boy's Conqueror's Haki was, by saying that it might have been even stronger than Shanks's. What's also noteworthy is that Dorian Brockie had also just experienced Warcurry's Conqueror's Haki, which was strong enough to shake an entire island, a feat that has only ever been done by Roger and Whitebeard in the story. Still, perhaps more impressive than all of this is that, somehow, Imu was able to sense Joy Boy's presence through the Haki, despite being half a world away in the Holy Land. I personally have no idea what could have happened here. In the story, we've seen characters like Enel, Shanks and Green Bull be able to use observation Haki to sense people from several kilometers away. But Imu sensing Joy Boy's Haki on Egghead from the Holy Land is something completely new. Simply sensing the Haki also made Imu scream. While Imu is extremely paranoid about anything related to the Void Century being revealed in the present day, he has always been very composed during these events. It's possible that Imu's reaction may have been of genuine fear and trauma of Joy Boy's power. Based on this display of Haki and the few things we know about him, Joy Boy very much comes across as someone stronger than even Gol D Roger, and he could perhaps be the strongest character who's ever lived in the One Piece world. He might not, however, be the only one whose strength has surpassed the Pirate King. Of these ancient characters, not only Joy Boy, but Imu is also someone likely stronger than Roger. While Joy Boy's power has been built up by different characters, we've so far had zero references to Imu's strength. Despite this, it can be rather safely argued that Imu is someone right at the pinnacle of power right next to Joy Boy. Many of the arguments that have been made about Joy Boy can also be made about Imu. He's someone who also lived in the Void Century and participated in the Great War, and, like Joy Boy, was seemingly the leader of his own faction. We also know that, despite him preferring to stay in the shadows, Imu is someone who can still get their hands dirty. When Sabo infiltrated Pangaea Castle during the reverie, he actually attacked Imu. The attack, however, had no effect on him, and we also saw that Imu is able to transform into a gigantic monster. While this is arguably not as bombastic as Joy Boy's Conqueror's Haki blast on Egghead, it still tells us a few things about Imu. Sabo is the user of the Mera Mera no Mi, which is a devil fruit with a lot of offensive potential. In the canonical Ace novel, Ace managed to burn Whitebeard with the fruit, in a period of time before Whitebeard became ill. While impressive, more than the actual feat, the important thing to note here is that this confirms that Imu is a fighter. The reason why this is so important is that it simultaneously pretty much confirms that Imu is by far and away the most experienced character in the history of the One Piece world. From what little we know, Imu is someone who's originally from the Void Century and has found a way to be immortal. This would mean that Imu is well over 800 years old, making him the oldest living One Piece character next to Shueisha. It could be that in all of these centuries, Imu has never stopped training his powers, and is currently far more powerful than he was even during the Great War against Joy Boy. While actual combat is the best way to become stronger in the One Piece story, there are many characters who have also become many times stronger through pure training. The best example of this is probably the Straw Hat crew themselves. The Straw Hats spent their 2-year time skip doing nothing but training. As a result, someone like Luffy, for example, went from struggling with early versions of the Pacifista to fighting someone as strong as Doflamingo. Because Imu has had literal centuries of time in between the Void Century and the current story, he could have possibly become many times stronger now than in the past. It's also possible that Imu has actually been fighting in this period, in a manner of speaking. It could be that Imu has actually engaged with the 5 elders regularly in sparring in the confines of the Holy Land. The elders are all strong fighters in their own right, and they're some of the few people Imu actually trusts. If they did spar, it could explain why the elders are so strong and why some of them have scars, despite them almost never leaving the Holy Land. Because of all the time that he's had, it's possible that Imu has also discovered entirely new levels to devil fruit abilities, as he might be the one person in history who's had their fruit for the longest time. This goes back to a concept brought up all the way back in Alabasta, where Crocodile said that devil fruit abilities can be brought to a whole other level through training. Imu would actually parallel Crocodile a lot here. Just like Imu, Crocodile apparently spent years laying low in Alabasta and not fighting anyone of note. If Crocodile was able to bring his devil fruit to an entirely new level in these years, one can imagine what Imu has managed to do in the centuries he's had. Haki is also an ability that we've seen can be brought to an entirely new level through simple training. For example, someone like Sanji still had not unlocked Haki before the time skip, yet after training for 2 years, he achieved Haki strong enough to fight top Yonko officers. In Wano, we also saw that Luffy mainly developed the skill to do internal damage with his Haki through training under Hyogoro. Even if Imu has gotten a lot stronger in the past 800 years, however, there is one point that can be brought up against how strong he is currently. This is the fact that Imu was visibly frightened after Joy Boy's power resurfaced in the present day on Egghead. Still, this surprisingly does not mean that Imu is weaker than Joy Boy. In One Piece, just like in real life, trauma isn't straightforward evidence of you being weaker than someone else. The most notable example of this in One Piece is probably Kaido. Kaido has clear trauma of Kozuki Oden from fighting him 20 years ago. Kaido's trauma is so strong that he actually experiences it even when Oden's mere retainers attack him. This does not necessarily mean that Kaido is weaker than Oden, as he's had 20 years to grow after their fight. However, no matter how strong Kaido would have become, he still would have retained the memories of Oden in the past, almost beating him. In the case of Imu, even if he is now far stronger than he was 800 years ago, he will likely still carry the memories of Joy Boy's power for the rest of his life. This ironically makes Imu a more human character, despite everything he's done to make himself into something more. Yet, even if Imu underneath everything is still a human, he could still be the strongest character who's currently alive in One Piece. And he's probably held this status for hundreds of years before Luffy or Roger were even born. This would mean that, even though Roger in the current One Piece story is by far and wide seen as the strongest person in history, the key to his reputation lies in exactly that word. History. Based on what we know, Joy Boy and Imu's strength more than likely far surpassed that of Gol D Roger, and the only reason why Roger has the reputation as the strongest is because both Joy Boy and Imu have been wiped from history. This would mean that in both history and during the time when Roger was alive, he was never the strongest person in the One Piece world. However, what if there was actually even more to this topic? If you recall, at the beginning of the video, I said that there might be other characters in this story stronger than Roger, other than just Joy Boy and Imu. While it's possible that figures like this existed during the Void Century, the characters I'm referring to actually lived in the same era as Roger. There's a genuine case to be made that Roger's greatest rivals, Whitebeard and Garp, were in their prime even stronger than Roger himself. This is admittedly a very unpopular take, and I myself have brought up evidence for why Roger was the strongest of these three men in this very video. However, there is actual evidence in the story that suggests that both Whitebeard and Garp may have actually in the end surpassed Roger. Edward Newgate and Monkey D. Garp are both legendary characters in the One Piece story, their biggest accomplishment actually being able to fight equally with the Pirate King, Gol D. Roger. However, in both the One Piece world and the real-life One Piece fandom, Whitebeard and Garp are considered to be weaker than Roger. I've done multiple polls on this channel about this topic, and Roger has always won by a considerable margin. Yet, what if the masses were actually wrong? What if, of the trio of Whitebeard, Garp and Roger, Roger was actually the weakest? There is actually evidence in the story that suggests that Whitebeard and Garp both achieved strength greater than even the Pirate King. This video will compare both of these characters to Roger in their prime, to decide who of them was the strongest. And the character we're going to start with is the second most infamous pirate in the story, Edward Newgate. Perhaps the biggest potential piece of evidence for Whitebeard being stronger than Roger is his title, the strongest man in the world. We'll next discuss what it actually means that Whitebeard had this title. What is extremely important to bring up is that this is a title Whitebeard already had in the time when Roger was alive. This information comes from the Vivre card databook, where both Whitebeard's older and younger cards refer to him as the strongest man. For disclosure, the Vivre card databooks are as canon as any One Piece material can get outside the actual volumes. This is because they are actually credited as being authored by Eiichiro Oda. This is a credit that is very rare among One Piece products. For example, all the One Piece movies, games and even the anime are only credited as being based on the works of Eiichiro Oda. Outside the manga, only a select few things like Chapter 0, the Ace novels, and the Vivre cards are actually authored by Oda. Oda has also personally said in the SBS of Volume 91 that this extra content is part of the story. If the Vivre cards are indeed canon, would Whitebeard possessing this title when Roger was alive then confirm that Whitebeard actually was stronger than Roger? Let's explore a bit deeper. A frequent theme in One Piece is actually that titles are not always 100% accurate. A lot of them are in fact inaccurate, because of things like misinformation and propaganda. While his Vivre card refers to him as the world's strongest man, this is clearly just a moniker. For example, Usopp in his Vivre card is also referred to as God in this exact same manner. What is however very interesting is that on the other side of Whitebeard's card, he is referred to by a different title. The card says that Kosuke Oden was recruited by Sekai Saikyo no Daikaisoku, which means the world's strongest great pirate. What is of note however is that this is not just a quoted title, like the world's strongest man, but actual text describing Whitebeard. Yet, even this does not necessarily mean that Whitebeard being the strongest is accurate. Even in other cases in the story, titles that have been presented like this have turned out to not be true. The most notable example of this are the Five Elders, who have the title, the highest authority in the world government. This is not only their moniker, but something the story presents multiple times as just being fact. This also extends to side material, where in One Piece Yellow Grand Elements, a databook that is once again giving the rare author credit of Eiichiro Oda, the elders are verbatim described as the highest authority in the world government, just like Whitebeard was referred to as the strongest great pirate. Naturally, readers who have read further into the story know that the Gorosei's title of being the highest authority in the world government is actually false, as their authority is superseded by Imu, the actual king of the world. The moral of the story is, no matter how they are presented, titles in One Piece have always been unreliable. In the case of Whitebeard, even though he is referred to as the strongest man in the world, or as the strongest great pirate in a time when Roger was alive, this is not a confirmation that he was stronger than Roger. At the same time, however, it also does not confirm that he wasn't stronger than Roger. Whitebeard had to get his reputation as the strongest from somewhere. While not necessarily fact, him still being known by the world as the strongest in the same era when Roger was fighting monsters like Garp and Shiki speaks volumes about Whitebeard's strength. There's even a possible hint that Whitebeard's fame superseding Roger's in the past, where in chapter 964, Shanks and Bucky are seen being annoyed at all the attention the world is giving Whitebeard, in an era when Roger was still active. To determine if Whitebeard's title of being the strongest pirate was actually accurate, the video will next analyze what we actually know about both Roger and Whitebeard's power, when they were both still alive. A natural place to start is with the fight we saw between these two characters during the Oden flashback. The most notable feat here is probably the Conqueror's Haki clash between Roger and Whitebeard, which split the skies and shook the entire island. Despite what some fans may think, splitting the skies does not mean that both of these characters were on an equal level. When Luffy and Kaido had a similar class of Conqueror's Haki during the Wano arc, they also split the skies. Luffy was however still significantly weaker than Kaido at this point in time, and this was still several chapters before Luffy had even awakened his Devil Fruit. An important thing to note is that a class of Conqueror's Haki is also just a feat of the character's aptitude with Conqueror's Haki, and does not take into account other abilities, such as Devil Fruit powers or physical strength. In other words, this clash between Roger and Whitebeard only tells us that both of their Conqueror's Haki was very strong, and at a level where it can't overwhelm the other, and the clash can't actually be used as evidence for either of them being stronger than the other. After this clash, Whitebeard and Roger actually went into a prolonged battle with both of their crews, that lasted for 3 whole days. While the battle was inconclusive, with no definitive victor, there is an actual argument that this battle made Whitebeard look more impressive than it did Roger. This is because, if we exclude the captains, the Roger pirates as a whole were very likely far stronger than the Whitebeard pirates at this point in time. Whitebeard's crew at this point was much younger and more inexperienced than the Roger pirates, who had already been active for years before the Whitebeard pirates even existed. There is also an argument that Whitebeard's followers never achieved the strength Roger's followers did. For example, Silver's Rayleigh, the vice captain of the Roger Pirates, believes that he could have possibly been an emperor of the sea in his younger days. It is also likely that Rayleigh is not exaggerating, as he is by nature very humble, and says this in reference to him no longer being at that level as an old man. This would be in contrast to someone like Marco, who was still a teenager when fighting the Roger Pirates. Marco, even in the present story, is someone who struggles with the Yonko and Navy admirals, and it is likely that he is far stronger now than over 20 years in the past. One big counter-argument in favor of the Whitebeard pirates being able to match the Roger pirates in the past is that Kosuke Oden was still a part of the crew at this point in time. However, even though Oden is very strong, it is very debatable if he alone was enough to overcome the difference between the two crews when excluding the captains. For example, even if Oden managed to occupy someone like Rayleigh, that would still leave the other inexperienced Whitebeard pirates against the battle-hardened veterans of the Roger pirates. If you think Oden was genuinely strong enough to essentially carry Whitebeard's entire crew, you're free to do so, but I personally find it rather hard to believe. If we are to assume that Roger's followers at this point in time were as a whole much stronger than Whitebeard's, it could be evidence that Whitebeard himself was the strongest person on the island at this time, and that he was the reason why the battle lasted for 3 days, without either side coming out on top. Still, even this is not that strong of an indicator. One big reason for this is just the fact that the battle lasted for 3 days, without either side being defeated. Characters in One Piece weaker than Roger and Whitebeard have fought for longer periods of time than this, and it's possible that either pirate crew would have definitively won had the battle continued. Furthermore, there's an argument that neither crew was taking this engagement particularly seriously. While rivals, Roger and Whitebeard had a lot of respect for one another, and Whitebeard was even among the few people Roger wanted to visit before his eventual death. Then there is also the fact that Roger came into this battle with the desire to meet and talk to Kosuke Oden, which would be rather difficult if the Roger pirates had actually tried to kill the Whitebeard pirates. One last thing to point out about this battle is that it is in a period of time when Roger was already sick, and Crocus said he only had a year left to live. While some fans claim that Roger's illness did not affect his strength, this is completely false. This claim comes from an interpretation of a scene in Chapter 0, where Bucky asks Crocus if Roger is able to fight because of his illness, to which Roger says that Roger is in perfect condition. This is entirely different from the illness not affecting Roger in the slightest. And this scene actually proves that the illness did affect Roger's fighting ability. It wouldn't make sense for Bucky to ask Crocus about Roger's condition if the illness had no effect on him. Crocus's answer also only means that Roger on that day was in good condition. Like many long-term illnesses in real life, there are good days and there are bad days. When Rayleigh describes Roger's illness, he says that Roger was in a lot of pain, and that Crocus only managed to lessen the pain enough for Roger to complete his final voyage. To further prove that the illness did affect Roger's day-to-day life, right before he heads for Laugh Tale, Roger is seen coughing and wheezing. If Roger already had symptoms like this on a regular day, one can only imagine how negatively the illness would affect him when he is physically exerting himself in a fight. This illness admittedly makes gauging Roger's prime as a fighter very difficult. It's hard to say whether Roger was actually in his prime during his last fight with Whitebeard. Roger at this point had already had the illness for years, and it could be that his best days were behind him. Alternatively, it's possible that Roger kept growing stronger during his illness, and was actually at his peak during the fight with Whitebeard, despite its effects. The story has examples of this kind of growth, where for example, Shanks, even after losing his left arm to the Lord of the Coast, managed to quadruple his bounty and become a Yonko in the years following his maiming. I won't stay too long on this point however, as there's genuinely no way to tell at what period Roger was at his strongest, based on what we know from the story. The video has so far brought up two major arguments as to why Whitebeard could have been stronger than Roger when he was alive. The first is that Whitebeard was literally known as the strongest man in the world, and the strongest great pirate in the world at this time. The second is that the Whitebeard pirates were somehow able to have a 3-day-long battle with the Roger pirates, despite Roger at the time likely having a far stronger crew than Whitebeard. However, both of these points have their caveats. The first is that titles in One Piece have a history of being inaccurate. Whitebeard's title being stated in plain text also does not change this. as other similar cases in the series have also been proven to be inaccurate. Whitebeard's last battle with Roger also has several things to note, such as the presence of Kozuki Oden, the fight likely not being that serious, and Roger during this fight being in the last stages of his illness. Even though this might sound like the analysis is leaning towards Roger being the stronger of the two, there is one last very important piece of evidence that could suggest that Whitebeard actually surpassed Roger in his prime. Before I reveal what this is though, I first need to analyze the other character this video is about. Just like with Whitebeard, most fans seemingly think that Garp in his prime was weaker than Roger. Regardless of fan opinion, however, it is very hard to argue that Garp was not someone very close to Roger's level. Garp's reputation around the world is that he managed to corner Roger several times in the past. What is very interesting is that this claim does not come from just the people, but from Roger himself. Right before his execution, Roger quite literally tells Garp that the two of them almost killed each other several times. This is arguably the single biggest statement of any one character's strength in the entire story. While the series is full of quotes relating to Roger and his strength, this is the only moment in the story where Roger himself directly says that another character was on his level. It is also very unlikely that Roger is lying here. The context of the scene is him asking Garp to take care of Ace. As Garp is a very honest and straightforward person, Roger buttering Garp up by exaggerating his strength would probably not work. Just to make it crystal clear, the translation of Roger saying that Garp almost killed him multiple times is also 100% accurate. The original Japanese of what Roger said is "Ore to omae wa nanchū kai to koroshiai yoshita nakadaro," which means, "You and I have almost killed each other dozens of times." This one sentence about Garp having almost killed Roger dozens of times has some pretty crazy implications. For one, we've never heard of any of Roger's other rivals, be it Whitebeard, Sebek, or Shiki, bringing Roger near death. Even crazier, however, is the possible context of Garp's fights with Roger. As brought up before, Roger always had a crew of elites with him, and we also know that someone like Rayleigh was with Roger since both of them were very young. This is compared to Garp, who is only a vice admiral, and has never in the story had any subordinates of note. From what we've seen, when Garp goes on missions in the story, he only has his one ship full of low-ranking marines with him. Garp's lack of manpower is demonstrated during the Egghead arc, where he asked Sword for help in rescuing Kobe, and even then only received marines ranked Rear Admiral and lower. Garp's only direct subordinate we know by name is Bogart, and he likely also isn't that strong, as he was also with Garp when he rescued Kobe, and we did not see him contribute to the mission in any way. Even though the idea is crazy, these are the facts. Garp almost always goes on missions without any strong allies with him. Roger when he was alive is almost never seen without his crew. Roger still said that Garp almost killed him dozens of times. In my mind, there's no other way to honestly interpret the story than that Garp was actually strong enough to at least a few times almost kill Roger by himself, when the other Roger pirates were also around. As impressive as this makes Garp look, there is still something to consider before any of you go and declare him the strongest in One Piece. This is Garp's reputation. Despite clearly being extremely strong, people in the One Piece world do not refer to Garp in the same way they refer to Roger and Whitebeard. Even though they're from the same era, Garp has never been called the strongest man in the world like Whitebeard was. People also never speak about Garp's strength in the same grandiose way they talk about Roger. When Kaido tells Luffy that Haki eclipses everything, he uses Roger as his example instead of Garp, even though it's all but confirmed that the latter also does not have a devil fruit ability. This is actually a frequent theme in the story, where even people who've had personal experiences with Garp do not refer to him as the strongest of his era. When Bucky talks about Whitebeard, he says that he was the only man who managed to fight on equal footing with Roger. Jin Chao, who viewed Garp as the devil himself, still thought that Roger was the greatest of his era, and even that Roger's blood held more power than Garp's blood. Shiki also thought that the idea of Marines actually capturing Roger was laughable. One could rightfully argue that, as pirates, all these characters would have a bias towards a Marine like Garp. However, even Sengoku, who is seemingly Garp's best friend, thought that Rocksteady Sebek might have been Roger's greatest foe over him. During Marineford, Sengoku also calls Whitebeard by his title, the world's strongest man. If you really want to push this idea, there's also a quote from Garp himself that could be interpreted as him viewing himself as weaker than Whitebeard. This is when he talks to Ace in Impel Down before the Summit War, and says that in angering Whitebeard, they've angered the King of the Seas. This is admittedly a pretty big conundrum. On the one hand, most things in the story seem to point to Garp being weaker than both Roger and Whitebeard. On the other hand, that single quote from Roger saying that Garp almost killed him dozens of times is better than any of the other claims about characters rivaling Roger, as it comes from Roger himself. My own conclusion, taking into account all the evidence presented in this video, is that it's still very hard to tell who actually was the strongest of Roger, Whitebeard and Garp when all three were alive. However, what is more clear is that, in the One Piece world, the man who is seen as the strongest by the people appears to be Roger. I went over this more in my previous video, but despite Whitebeard's title, there are simply way more moments in the story where characters refer to Roger as the strongest of his era than with any of the other characters. Still, Whitebeard and Garp have one more card to play in this debate. Let's say that the people of the One Piece world are correct, and Roger when he was alive was stronger than both Garp and Whitebeard. There is still a possibility that Garp and Whitebeard surpassed Roger after his death. Both of them were in their 50s when Roger died, but despite what some of you may think, One Piece characters can still grow even at this age. An example of this would be someone like Ashura Doji, who was 56 by the time of the Wano arc, yet says that the last 20 years of his life have only made him stronger. From every case we've seen in the story, only characters who are 70 and older have noted about how old age has made them weaker. This would mean that Garp and Whitebeard might have still both had years of growth left, even after Roger's death. We also know that, after Roger's execution, Garp and Whitebeard did not retire, and still frequently took part in combat. As a Yonko, and the world's most infamous pirate after Roger's death, Whitebeard was a constant target of people trying to claim his head, and the number of these people probably only increased with the Great Pirate Era. According to Crocodile, the world is actually full of pirates who failed to kill Whitebeard, and many of them were apparently strong enough to end up in level 6 of Impel Down. While readers may think that, because Whitebeard never wanted to be the Pirate King, it also means that he didn't have the same drive to become the strongest, like for example Luffy. This is however more than likely not true. As a Yonko, Whitebeard had thousands of followers and a number of territories looking to him for protection. We also know that Whitebeard put all the loot he gained as a pirate back into supporting his home island of Sphinx. To protect his family and the people who relied on him, Whitebeard had huge motivation to be as strong as he possibly could. We also see that Whitebeard is very proud of his strength, when he is insulted when the Marines in the Summit War think they can kill him. Like Whitebeard, Garp also had similar obligations to maintain his strength after Roger's execution, where he remained in active duty in the Marines. In fact, we know that Garp had a very big fight only a few days before Roger's execution, when him and Sengoku had to fight Shiki at Marineford. Roger's death also likely made the government rely a lot more on Garp, as Roger's final words led to a mass influx of pirates in the world. As Garp detests pirates, he also was likely very willing to combat this new threat. This was also still a period of time when the likes of Sakazuki, Borsalino and Kusan were not yet admirals, and were still rising through the ranks. We also know that Garp in this time also frequently trained with Kusan, and Brand New even comments that Garp's training was a central part of what made him so strong. As brought up before in this video, while there's an argument that Roger might have been the strongest when him, Garp and Whitebeard were still alive, the three were still probably very close to each other in strength. It would therefore be not at all unlikely that Garp and Whitebeard both managed to surpass Roger's strength in the years after his death, before they got too old. This would also not contradict Roger's worldwide reputation as the strongest of the trio even in the present day, as the public is clearly not aware of how strong Garp and Whitebeard could have gotten through simply training. I'm personally still open to the idea of Roger being the strongest of the trio, but from trying to read the facts of the story as honestly as I can, I genuinely think the evidence is pointing towards both Garp and Whitebeard in the end surpassing Roger. Monkey D. Dragon is introduced to the One Piece story as the world's worst criminal. Since bounties indicate a criminal's danger to the world government, one might assume that Dragon has the series' highest bounty. However, this is likely false. In truth, Gol D. Roger's already revealed bounty is probably higher than Dragon's or any other characters in One Piece history. Although Dragon's bounty is still unknown, we know Roger earned a 5.5 billion berry bounty from the Wano arc. The far more important piece of information revealed here, however, is that this is the highest bounty of any pirate in history. This eliminates any other pirates from consideration for the highest bounty. However, Monkey D. Dragon remains in contention as he is a revolutionary, not a pirate. Dragon himself makes it clear that pirates are distinct from revolutionaries in his introductory chapter when he talks about Luffy. Yet, even though Dragon is not a pirate, it can be definitively proven that his bounty is still lower than Roger's. While Dragon is known as the world's worst criminal, this is something he has only been referred to as in the present story of One Piece, where Gol D. Roger has already been dead for years. We know that titles in One Piece change based on whether a character is alive. For example, Kaido is known by many as the strongest in the post-time skip One Piece world. Yet, most characters thought that title belonged to Whitebeard when he was still alive. Furthermore, Kaido all but admits that Roger was someone stronger than him. In short, Dragon being the world's worst criminal only pertains to the present, and it leaves the door open for Roger having been an even bigger criminal when he was alive. The biggest piece of evidence that this was actually the case is found in the Marineford arc. When Sengoku announces to the world that Ace is Roger's son, he says that Ace carries the blood of the most terrible fiend the world has ever known. In the original Japanese, the words he uses are Sekai Saidai no Aku no Chi, which could be directly translated as the world's most evil blood. Roger being referred to as the most evil being in history arguably trumps any title Dragon has received in terms of infamy. Sengoku himself says this in the present story, where Dragon is already known as the world's worst criminal. As the fleet admiral of the Marines, Sengoku is also a very good source of information, as he is for example the character who first revealed to the readers the information about the Rocks Pirates and the God Valley incident. If his words are taken at face value, then the only reason why Dragon is able to claim the title of the world's worst criminal is because Roger is dead. After Roger reached Laugh Tale and became the Pirate King, he could have simultaneously become the world's worst criminal, not only of his time, but in recorded history. This would certainly line up with how dangerous the world government considers people who study the ancient history to be. As we've seen in the present story, the government is willing to kill even someone like Dr. Vegapunk, the person behind most of their scientific advancement, simply because he studied a bit of that history. In this regard, Roger is inarguably more dangerous than Dragon. According to both Rayleigh and Oden, Roger learned everything about the Void Century when he reached the final island. Dragon, on the other hand, did not even know that the ancient weapons were real until meeting Robin during the time skip. Inadvertently, Roger having a higher bounty than Dragon actually gives a very good approximation of how much Monkey D. Dragon's bounty is worth. Dragon already held the title of the world's worst criminal in the pre-time skip, a time in which Whitebeard was still alive. If we take the title as being synonymous with having the highest active bounty, then that would mean that Dragon's bounty is somewhere between Whitebeard and Roger's bounties of 5 and 5.5 billion berries respectively. However, this video is not done yet. Even if this were to prove that Roger has a higher bounty than Dragon or any other pirate in history, there are still two characters who would possibly have a higher bounty than the Pirate King. The first of these is Rocks D. Zebek. While Roger may have the highest bounty in history, Zebek is a figure who has seemingly been erased from history. Sengoku himself refers to Zebek as being perhaps Roger's greatest enemy, and he is also someone who, like Roger, broke the world's taboos. While this may seem like a compelling argument, it can actually already be proven that Roger's bounty was also higher than Zebek's. While Zebek is a figure mostly lost to history in the present story, this was always not the case. Around 40 years ago, Zebek was a world-renowned criminal who posed an immense threat to the government. Even if the government later tried to wipe him from history, Zebek most certainly had a bounty when he was still alive. As evidenced by characters like Luffy, Robin, and Roger himself, the government without exception gives bounties to dangerous criminals even if they're connected to the world's taboos. As mentioned earlier, Roger and Whitebeard are said to have the highest bounties of any pirates in history. This is information that was stated in the same scene where Sengoku revealed everything about Zebek and the Rocks Pirates, meaning that there was no longer any reason to lie about him or the value of his bounty. This would actually mean that not only Roger, but Whitebeard also managed to surpass Zebek's bounty. While this video isn't about how powerful characters are, this is a fairly big piece of evidence about Sebek actually not being as strong as either Roger or Whitebeard. Sebek had every reason to have a higher bounty than Whitebeard, as he was a terrorist who targeted the government and had a much stronger pirate crew under him than the Whitebeard pirates. One could perhaps point to the Guragoro no Mi as being the source of Whitebeard's high bounty. Yet, Blackbeard, despite having the same fruit, only had a bounty of around 2.2 billion after the time skip. The only thing Whitebeard possibly could have had to earn a higher bounty than his former captain was personal strength. In the grand scheme of things, the story is suggesting that Sebek was still a few steps away from Roger and Whitebeard in being either the most infamous or the strongest pirate. There is, however, a far better contender for a character who could have been over Roger, which is the first Joy Boy. While we do not know much about him, what little there is in the story points to Joy Boy being an enormously powerful figure. After discovering the true history, Roger himself said that he would have wanted to live in the same era as Joy Boy. Later, Roger also said that someone in the future would come and surpass him, which is more than likely in reference to Luffy, the second coming of Joy Boy. If this wasn't convincing enough, someone like King thought that Kaido was Joy Boy simply because of his strength. Kaido himself dismissed the idea, but further built up Joy Boy's power by believing that he would be the person who would come and beat him. If this build-up is to be believed, the original Joy Boy could well have been a stronger character than Roger. Any allusions to Roger being the worst criminal in history would also not apply to him, as Joy Boy has been well and truly erased from the records, and someone like Sengoku might not even be aware that he ever existed. Yet, despite all of this, Roger still beats Joy Boy when it comes to the question of who has the highest bounty. This is because Joy Boy more than likely did not even have a bounty. The bounties are a system created by the world government, an institution that was established at the very end of the Void Century. This would mean that once the government started issuing bounties, the world had already moved on from Joy Boy's era. However, there is still even more to this video. While Roger currently holds the highest bounty in One Piece history, it may not be the case by the story's end. You may already guess who the character who will finally surpass Roger's bounty is going to be. What might surprise you though is that there could be two characters with higher bounties than Roger by the time the story is done. Before I reveal who these two characters are though, I would really appreciate it if you'd subscribe to the channel. Subscribers don't genuinely mean all that much, but I've been led to believe that Shueisha only copyright strikes smaller channels. Getting a high subscriber count could go a long way in protecting my content from deranged Japanese companies. The first character who is said to surpass Roger's bounty is Monkey D. Luffy. Luffy is backed by several characters and prophecies in the story to be the man who will surpass Gol D. Roger. If Luffy succeeds and reaches the final island like Roger did, the world government will probably give him a higher bounty than the former Pirate King. At this point, Luffy would not only have learned the true history, but he also possesses the Hito Hito no Mi Model Nika, the same fruit as Joy Boy. The government are extremely afraid of said warrior of liberation, and would have every reason to see Luffy at this point as being a bigger threat than Roger. This would likely put Luffy's bounty at around 5.6 billion berries, just a bit over Roger's. This is because the numbers 5 and 6 can be read in Japanese as go mo, meaning rubber. This is the same kind of wordplay used in many of the story's bounties. For example, Katakuri's bounty of 1,057,000,000 is likely a reference to him being above 5 and 6, or Gomu. This would be reflective of his fight with Luffy during Whole Cake Island, where Katakuri frequently demonstrated his powers as being superior to Luffy's. Luffy's 5.6 billion berry bounty may actually be his final one in the story. If Luffy were to do what Whitebeard said and challenge the government to a fight after reaching Laugh Tale, the government may not have an opportunity to raise Luffy's bounty any further. If Luffy succeeded in taking down the government, there would naturally be no institution left to give him a higher bounty. By the end of the story, Luffy may well have eclipsed Roger in terms of power and infamy, but his bounty may still remain only a bit higher than his. We now come to the final part of the video where we discuss the character who might have the final highest bounty ever in the entire story, even higher than Luffy or Roger. That character would be none other than the king of the world, Imo. In the final saga of One Piece, the Cross Guild, led by Buggy, Crocodile and Mihawk, has started issuing bounties to marines and presumably other world government agents. The Cross Guild is also incredibly wealthy, being able to offer the same amount of money for navy admirals that the government is giving for emperors of the sea. Because they've chosen to target the government, the Cross Guild clearly has very ambitious goals, not all that different from the Rocks Pirates or the Revolutionary Army. Furthermore, the Cross Guild, thanks to Buggy, is now on a path to discovering the true history by going after the One Piece. If the Cross Guild discovers the existence of Imo, they may well give him the highest bounty of any character ever in the One Piece story. If a single admiral is already worth 3 billion berries in their eyes, one can only guess how much money someone like Crocodile would be willing to give for the bona fide god emperor of the One Piece world. In a twist of irony, one could see this as Imu inheriting Dragon's title of world's worst criminal. After all, it was already established in Marineford that the strong get to decide what justice is. As Imu is a monster who's willing to commit genocide just to protect his own identity, the title would certainly fit him better than Dragon. Yet, this last part about Imu's bounty is just speculation. Ultimately, this video only aimed to prove with evidence that Monkey D. Dragon does not in fact have the highest bounty in the story. While it is the prevailing theory in the fandom, particularly since Dragon's title was initially mistranslated as the world's most wanted man, there is simply more evidence for Roger having a higher bounty. In this last part of this compilation video, I will discuss the idea that, before Dracule Mihawk, the former world's strongest swordsman in One Piece was actually none other than Gol D. Roger. There are actually several things in the story that could indicate Roger being not only the Pirate King, but also the pinnacle of swordsmen when he was alive. This may not only be hinted at by Roger's character, but it could also be connected to a lot of things we know about not only Mihawk, but also Shanks' character. The first major hint that Roger was Mihawk's predecessor is the simple fact that he was an extremely powerful swordsman. In fact, it is very hard to believe that there was a swordsman in the world stronger than Roger, in the time when he was alive. As discussed in many of the other parts of this compilation, Roger was one of the most powerful characters in the history of the One Piece world. We've also seen that his main method of combat was without mistake sword fighting. Whether it is against Whitebeard, Rocks, Shiki, or Oden, Roger is always seen charging into battle with his sword. To further prove that Roger mainly relied on his sword in combat, Kaido confirms that Roger had no devil fruit powers. Roger's sword is also not just any sword, but one of the 12 supreme Great Blades, the strongest weapons in all of One Piece, and the same grade wielded by the current world's strongest swordsman. For full disclosure, it could also be said that Roger has been canonically referred to as a swordsman, due to Oda himself referring to him as such in volume 101. I do not, however, think this confirmation is particularly necessary, as being a swordsman is pretty evidently a core part of Roger's identity in the actual manga. The evidence for this comes from the name of Roger's sword, which is Ace, the same name Roger later gave to his son. This further hones in on how important swordplay was to Roger. Not only is Roger someone who wields a sword when facing the strongest pirates on the seas, his sword was actually so dear to him that he named his son after it. Another hint that sword fighting was something very important to Roger comes from Shanks. Roger originally found Shanks as a baby on God Valley 38 years ago, and it is very likely that he actually raised him. The two also clearly developed a special bond, as Roger ended up giving his straw hat to Shanks at a very young age. Another thing we know about Roger's bond with Shanks is that Roger is probably the person who taught Shanks how to fight. This is seen in the present story, where Shanks uses the same sword moves that Roger did. This further highlights Roger's likely identity as a swordsman, where he even wanted to teach his skills to who was essentially his surrogate son. Still, it's one thing for Roger to be a swordsman, and another thing for him to have been the world's strongest swordsman back when he was alive. However, it is actually extremely easy to argue that he was. As brought up earlier, Roger was so strong that him being a swordsman almost guarantees that he was also the strongest swordsman of his era. This can be deduced through a simple process of elimination, where, when looking at the strongest characters of Roger's era, most of them weren't swordsmen. Roger's two greatest rivals, Garp and Whitebeard, were neither swordsmen, and used other weapons in combat. Of Roger's era, the only swordsmen that stand out are Shiki, Oden, and Big Mom. And, as brought up earlier in this compilation, there's moments in the story that heavily indicate that these three were all weaker characters than Roger during his era. Unless there was some unknown character from Roger's era that we do not yet know about, it is actually surprisingly hard to imagine another predecessor to Mihawk's title than Roger, considering just how strong of a swordsman he actually was. Let's say that this is actually true, and Roger before his death was indeed the world's strongest swordsman. This could not only add further lore to Roger and the One Piece story, but it could also explain a lot about Mihawk and Shanks' characters. Mihawk was actually present at Roger's execution in Logtown, and it's possible that, just like with many of the other characters watching the event, Roger inspired him to become a pirate. We've also discovered that, during the years after Roger's execution, Shanks and Mihawk were rival swordsmen who dueled one another. It could be that both of them were actually inspired by Roger, and wanted to follow his legacy by becoming the next world's strongest swordsman. While Roger being an important figure in Mihawk's life is not something that's all too clear from the story, there is actually something that we know about Mihawk that could indicate this. This is the fact that, among the Straw Hats, he is not only interested in Zoro, but also in Luffy. When Mihawk first meets Luffy at Baratie, he takes an immediate interest in him, and tells Luffy that the path to become the Pirate King is even more perilous than becoming the world's strongest swordsman. After Baratie, Mihawk frequently follows Luffy's journey, where he even meets with people like Shanks and the other warlords to hear more about the Straw Hats. This interest also clearly extends beyond Luffy simply being Zoro's captain, where, when Mihawk encounters Luffy at Marineford, he thinks about Luffy as a leader, and how he has the potential to be the most dangerous man on the seas. It could be that Mihawk, like many other characters in the story, sees a lot of Roger in Luffy. This could all connect to Mihawk's own connection to Roger, and how Roger could have been the former world's strongest swordsman, and possibly the man who originally inspired Mihawk to go on his path. As brought up before, however, Roger being Mihawk's predecessor could not only tell us a lot about Mihawk, but also about Shanks. It is also possible that Shanks in the past also wanted to become the world's strongest swordsman, because of Roger. While someone like Mihawk could have been inspired by Roger's power, for Shanks, his reasons might have been more personal. As the man who gave Shanks the Straw Hat, and his likely father figure, Shanks likely wanted to succeed Roger's legacy, and live up to his example. We've seen that Shanks as an adult emulates Roger in several ways, and that Shanks frequently thinks back to his former captain. If Roger was the former world's strongest swordsman, and the Pirate King, it could be that Shanks in the past wanted to follow his legacy, by getting both of these titles. This could explain why Shanks chose to duel someone like Mihawk, even though it wouldn't get him any closer to claiming the One Piece. More importantly, however, this could explain what happened in Chapter 1, when Shanks lost his arm in rescuing Luffy. When talking to Whitebeard, Shanks says that he bet his arm on the next generation, heavily implying that he deliberately lost it. This always struck me as a bit odd. While Shanks giving his hat to Luffy clearly has a lot of meaning, I never could quite figure out why Shanks specifically decided to sacrifice his arm. It's also noteworthy that Shanks didn't just lose an arm, but his dominant arm. Whenever Shanks appears in flashbacks, he is always seen wielding a sword in his left hand. What this could all mean is that Shanks decided that Luffy, not him, was going to be Roger's successor, and that losing his arm to Shanks meant giving up on he himself becoming the next Roger. Before meeting Luffy, Shanks could have been someone who wanted to be like Roger in every way. This could be seen in him building his own crew to be like the Roger Pirates, being the exact same type of captain as Roger, and repeating all of Roger's accomplishments, including potentially becoming the world's strongest swordsman. But it could be that Luffy changed all of this. As we've seen, Shanks is still going after the One Piece even in the present story, but it could be that he is now doing it as himself, not as Roger's successor, which he could think Luffy is better suited for. As we've seen in the manga, Shanks is actually a strikingly different pirate now than he was in Chapter 1. He is constantly seen thinking about the big picture, and he actively participates in the politics of the world. This is strikingly different from Luffy and Roger, who were much more carefree and focused on the adventure side of being a pirate. It could be that this was all a choice Shanks made by losing his arm, where he was going to go about being a different kind of pirate than his captain. As a brief summary, this last theory went through the idea that of all the characters, Roger was the former world's strongest swordsman before Mihawk, and that he was the one who originally inspired both Shanks and Mihawk to claim his title. This could explain a lot of things about the story, such as why Mihawk is so interested in Luffy, and why Shanks specifically sacrificed his sword arm in Chapter 1. If you've actually watched this entire 1 hour long video to the very end, thank you so much. If my last compilation video is any indication, only the top 20% of viewers were crazy enough to accomplish this feat. If you're somehow still hungry for more content, you could follow this up by actually watching exactly that video, which is another hour of me talking about nothing but the 5 elders, such as what their origin could be and who's the strongest among them. And once again, thanks a lot for making it all the way to the end.